Okay, inshallah, we'll go ahead and begin since it's 5 minutes after. Jazakallah khairan for everyone for joining week 16. As the title indicates, we'll be discussing Maqasid al-Shari'ah, or what can be translated as the objectives of the Shari'ah. Really, there's just 3 more weeks left of the course, right? We have ijtihad and then a session after about discussing differences amongst jurists and how to proceed forward with that, followed by our last conclusion session. So it's been 19 weeks coming up, but we're almost there. We appreciate everyone for joining us live, and for those who do watch the recordings, barakallahu feekum. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it to Dr. Osman Urmaji, who's joining us for the second week, inshallah.
جزاكم الله خير. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وبعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. It's an honor again to present to you all. Inshallah, we'll pick up where we left off last week. As the secondary sources, as we'll reiterate today, a lot of them had to do with the topic of Maqasid al-Shari'ah. And before I go formally into the details of the subject, just a brief introduction kind of on the subject matter itself. And if you're involved with, listening to the conversations, mainly in the West, but I think generally worldwide, about Islamic law and Sharia and Islamophobia and all the anti-Sharia legislation, what you'll notice is that in the last actually half century, just kind of globally, there has been an increased attention to the subject by scholars worldwide. A lot has been written by different scholars, primarily in the East, but some in the West. And what I find to be very interesting is that this is almost, when it initially began as a scholarly conversation, it has now become almost like a buzzword that is been appropriated in many circles of Muslims. And I'm saying this to preface that sometimes things can be intrinsically good and can have merit, but oftentimes when words get hijacked, we begin to become very skeptical of them. So I think maqasid is one of those words that those who are extremely, I don't want to use the word just liberal, but pretty much want to follow their hawa, those who want to follow their desires and want to make Islam conform to what their nafs craves, what their souls crave, they invoke maqasid as a framework. So we want to be very cautious about that, while at the same time not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so inshallah, what we'll do today is try to unpack from a very, very high level, what is this subject, what does it cover, its relationship to Usul, some practical examples. And so it's going to be a lot to cover in 90 minutes. So please, again, feel free and ask questions so we can clarify. So if we just move forward. So again, we're building off of last week and we'll jump right into the topic. Okay, so the first thing, I will skip some of this, but the definitions of the terms. The word maqasid, it comes from the Arabic word, it's the Arabic plural of the word maqsad, which is a term that denotes a path, a way, a means, a method. And Sharia, right, has multiple meanings as well. One of the meanings of Sharia that the Quran uses is also like a way of life. And also the word Sharia in the Arabic language linguistically refers to a place where one goes to get water. So if you're to literally translate maqasid of Sharia, it would be kind of the means or the purposes of the way of life. But let's give a more formal definition, and I'm going to give a few, as I usually like to. And I'll begin by the definition of who I consider to be the foremost scholar, probably in the history of legal theory, to be the one who's probably written the most prolifically on maqasid, and that is Imam al-Shatibi, the great Maliki jurist, who said the objectives of the Sharia, this is his definition of maqasid, the objectives of the Sharia are to establish universal benefit for man in the affairs of this life and the next, upon a system that will make its adherents true servants of Allah voluntarily as they are involuntarily, meaning as dictated by the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This definition comes from his great book, Al-Muwafaqat. It was a book in Usul al-Fiqh, and he had 2 different sections. One where he spoke about maqasid of the legislator, and one of the maqasid of those who are legislated, of the mukallafin. So what he means by this is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us in our fitrah. There's a qadr that exists in the world that we succumb to it whether we like it or not. Our hearts beat, whether we choose for them to beat or not, right? Our lungs, right, the way that they help us breathe. So our bodies voluntarily submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and involuntarily submit to Allah. And that involuntary submission to Allah is good for us, right? If we had to consciously think about taking a breath every second or two in order to survive, or we had to consciously make sure that our heart is beating, right? That would be a lot of hardship. So Allah has forced us essentially to do these actions that are inherently good for us. And the inverse of that is that, well, the Sharia and the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has legislated for us, this is where we have choice. And so there are universal laws that we have no choice over, like I mentioned, gravity and these type of things, but there are laws we have a choice over to do certain things and not to do certain things. And if we follow them, we will achieve the benefits that Allah intended for us in both this life and the next, and which will fulfill us being true servants of Allah. Because everyone is a servant of Allah if they just follow the qadr mandates that they are forced to, be the abd of Allah. But to be the voluntary servant of Allah is another level. So this is what he meant by Maqasid of Sharia. Another definition that was given says that the science of studying the higher objectives and secrets of the framework of the Sharia and its laws, and organizing its benefits for mankind in both lives upon its essence. And this is a more modern definition. Again, the idea is that it is the Maqasid of Sharia is a framework. It helps organize how the laws that Allah has given us and mandated for us are beneficial and in a very structured fashion. The third definition is that the Maqasid of Sharia are the underlying causes and wisdom that the legislator considers in general and specific matters of legislation in order to secure benefit for our servants. And the last definition, and they're all very similar, is that the Maqasid of the Sharia are the higher objectives, the ghayat, that the legal system was intended to realize for the benefit of man. So all these definitions repeat one word that I highlighted in red, and the word benefit or maslaha is always used in speaking about the subject of Maqasid al-Sharia. So this notion that there is maslaha, you can translate it to being that which is of interest to some, it's of interest, it's of benefit, it's inherently beneficial or good, right? This creeps into every single concept of Maqasid. And so what I would like to do is kind of break this out a bit and spend some time laying this foundation, because there is folks and people trained in Islamic universities and jurists and people in positions of ifta who actually don't think about this. And they think about that the Sharia is simply, or Usul al-Fiqh in particular, is a system, is a science that is derivative, where you take evidence, you put it through a system, and whatever the answer is, you act upon it, even if it's detrimental or harmful. And so what you'll find is that many jurists, they disagree with this, classical jurists. They say, no, that the law itself is meant to have benefit. And if it's not achieving benefit, then it is not from the Sharia. And so I'll give you two perspectives on this. One is by the great scholar, the Hanbali, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah. And he said in his book, I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in, those who sign off on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said that the Sharia is predicated upon masalih for the creation. So everything in the Sharia is predicated on being of benefit for the creation. And then he said that this point is extremely important, for grave misunderstandings of the Sharia have resulted due to ignorance of this fact. He said the misunderstandings have created undue hardships, difficulties, and burdens that one could not arrive at had he known that the Sharia, which is at the highest level of benefit, does not bring. He said the Sharia is founded upon wisdom and benefit for the creation in this life and the next. It is absolute justice, mercy, benefit, and wisdom. Any matter that deviates from justice to injustice, mercy to cruelty, from benefit to harm, or wisdom to futility, then it is not in reality from the Sharia, even if it is assumed to be part of it due to an incorrect interpretation. So again, what he's getting at here is that if one is given an opinion, or if one finds a position in Islamic law that at the time the opinion was given led to injustice, it led to something harmful, it led to something futile, then he says this is actually not a valid Shari'i opinion. And you'll see how he gets into that later. The other great example is by Al-Izz ibn Abdul Salam. He is one of the foremost scholars of Maqasid as well. In his great book called Al-Qawaid al-Kubra, it's a 2-volume book pretty much on maslaha and what is maslaha. He said all of the Sharia is maslaha. By its definition, it is intrinsically benefit. And then he began to break out what the word benefit means. He said it is either achieved, benefit is of two types. It is either acquiring something that is good, so acquiring something beneficial, or preventing something that is harmful. So either way, either you acquire something that's good or you push away something that's bad. Both of those are beneficial. And that's what the Sharia is trying to do. And so everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded, this is his text from his book. everything that Allah has commanded has benefit in both lives or in at least one life. And everything that Allah has prohibited is harmful in both lives or at least one of those lives. And here what he's getting at is that if there's something which is wajib, that wajib, by its definition of being a wajib, is good for you in the dunya and the deen, so in this life and the next, and that's the highest level of a wajib, or at least for your akhirah, so at least in your faith, or even at least in your dunya. And of course, if that is done with the right niyyah, then of course it'll achieve both. And the inverse is true. So everything prohibited, right, is harmful in either both lives or at least one. Then he says that whatever is acquired to achieve the maximum benefit is the best of deeds, and whatever is acquired to achieve the most detriment is considered the worst of deeds. And this is what he's getting at, is that there are different levels to what Allah has told us to do. So even the idea of something being wajib or being an obligation, there are different grades of wajibs. And there's different grades of that which is mustahab or sunnah, and different grades of the mubah, and different grades of the haram and the makruh. Because some wajibs achieve more benefit than others, and some sunnahs achieve more benefit than the others. So we'll walk later on in the presentation, I'll give you some more concrete examples of this. And then he said this beautiful statement, which I like. He said that medicine is like law, placed to achieve the benefit of health and well-being, to prevent the harms of sickness and disease. So a physician who practices medicine, who sees patients, the goal of the physician is to cure and benefit the health of the patient. And that physician might give a different prescription, might have a different way that the patient should, considering the patient's background, right, will take into account their background and prescribe something different. If they know that they're at a high risk for something, they may not give them some procedure. But the point is that they're using their mind. They don't just say, well, in this case, we advocate a surgery. That's what's considered best. If you die, you die. No, it's really, you think about the well-being and the health of the individual. And the same way, the law and the Shari'ah is also trying to prevent the harms of sickness and disease in the heart of the person. And so if you don't think about the objective and you don't think about what's beneficial, then the likelihood of giving wrong legal answers is very high and possibly very detrimental. Which gets us to, well, why should we then study this field? Clarifying the perfection of Islamic law and increasing confidence in Islam. To me, the very foremost reason that Maqasid should be studied is that we live in a generation of all of you who have kids or who grew up in this country. For everything that happens, we want to know why. So the question of why do we pray and why do we do this? And it's just a standard thing that this generation in the West in particular always wants to know the reasoning or the rationale for things. And to tell people, well, that's just the way it is not satisfactory to many of the hearts and the minds that are out there. So clarifying the perfection of law. So when a child asks, well, mom, why do I do this? Or even an adult says, well, why do I have to follow this transactional law? Knowing the reason behind it, knowing the objective of that behavior, it increases one's confidence in faith. That my faith is not just this random set of laws that don't make sense, that I have to follow even if they're harmful to me. That no, the faith that I'm following, the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually beneficial for me. And that's why I should be following that. The individual benefits more from the act of worship when he understands the purpose. Right? And that's almost an obvious one, that when you know why you're doing something and there's a deeper motivation of engaging in it when you understand what you're going to get out of it. So if you think about even salah, right? The person who thinks that salah is something I just got to do and you rush through it like a chicken and you don't think about it being something that actually is beneficial, that performance of the salah will be so different than the one who thinks about salah as the purpose of it is to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to make that connection with Allah, as Allah says in Surah Al-Ankabut. It addresses doubts and misconceptions and supposed contradictions. So many doubts about Islamic law. So when one thinks about inheritance law, well, why does the son get this portion over the daughter? Or in marriage law and divorce law, why does the man have the right of divorce and the woman doesn't have the right of divorce? All these different doubts that creep into people's minds and the possible contradictions that they see in narrations, we'll begin to understand those better when you have a deep understanding of the objectives of the law. It broadens one's mindset by looking at things within a larger framework. So like I said at the outset, that this is a framework for thinking about law. So instead of looking at a law just as kind of a random opinion or a random issue, that you fit that into a broader system. and you say, okay, what do these laws try to achieve at the individual level, at the communal level, and at the broader societal level? It also helps us prioritize deeds. If you know that something is from the most important objectives of Islam, that would take priority over something which is a lower objective. And one of the things that we find today is people in different kind of camps of Muslims, they have this strange prioritization of deeds. So I remember being at a conference years ago, and people who had a very, very strong extreme leaning to Sufism, they were arguing that we need to follow the Sunnah, and their points of the Sunnah were extremely, like, I don't want to say, they were minor, I'll put it that way. They're not things that are from the major affairs of this deen. So I remember the scholar giving a detailed explanation of, for instance, why we have to sleep on our right side, right? And how this sunnah is a lost sunnah, and if we don't do it, how we're kind of not following the Prophet's life. And I'm scratching my head thinking, subhanAllah, how many sunnahs are out there that are far more important? And Ibn al-Qayyim actually spoke about this in his book, Al-Fawaid, and he said that you'll see many people who will advocate for some of the more minor sunnahs while purposely ignoring the larger ones, and that's a form of deception, right? And to be very cautious of not allowing yourself to get misguided by that. So never to say that any sunnah is insignificant, but there are things in our deen that take priority over others. And so we want to make sure if we understand the purpose of an act, and that purpose of the act is far higher than another act, that we make sure we prioritize that in our life. It closes the means to haram, and it opens the means to halal. As we spoke about last week with Saddu Dariya, and we'll go back and do that today, a little bit about when something looks like it will lead to a haram, how the jurist thinks about the goal of the law and the purpose of the law to close those doors that will lead to detriment. In the same case, he might open doors that lead to benefit. And then as we'll speak about from a more usuli perspective, in ijtihad, the jurist might think about it in tarjih, in legal preference. So if a jurist is debating between different opinions to pull from, and he sees the validity in 2 or 3 different arguments, that how he or she decides to pick an opinion will be based upon their understanding of what is the outcome and the consequence of it. What do they achieve by following one opinion over the other? And the last, as Ibn Taymiyyah has written extensively about in Ibn al-Qayyim, is that understanding the Maqasid eliminates legal tricks and loopholes that might be out there. So, I mean, as you can see, whether the person is just like a child or a layman or a serious student or a jurist, Maqasid has a very powerful effect on their faith and their ability to get better understand Islam and better practice their faith. I'll quickly jump. This is kind of a tangent, but I did want to mention it because we are in this class, which is a class of Usul al-Fiqh, and Abu Tariq chose to put in Maqasid as one of the subjects, which is interesting because there has been a debate whether Maqasid, what is its role in Usul al-Fiqh or in law or in the Islamic sciences. And so the first position is that Maqasid is actually an independent science, and they claim these scholars will say that it's not a part of Usul. So it would be, you would study Usul by itself, and then in a different realm, you would study Maqasid, and then yes, you'd bring those two together. And so some of the more contemporary scholars like Taha ibn Ashur and others would argue that Maqasid should not be included in Usul al-Fiqh as a branch of it. They're the minority. There's the far more, his classical majority would say that Maqasid fits in as a subsection or a sub-science in Usul. So scholars like Sayfuddin al-Amidi, Imam Shatibi, and more contemporary folks like Sheikh Raisuni, they all argue that Maqasid is a part of Usul and it should not be separated. And I think that the argument is it's not that important, because at the end of the day, I really like this statement, is that Maqasid and Usul are like the soul and body that cannot be detached. And so whether you consider them as being connected or as being two distinct entities, they absolutely have to function simultaneously, right? One could not say, well, the soul and body are two things that are completely separate. Well, if they're not combined, they have no meaning between them, right? The body has no life, right, without a soul, right? And the soul cannot exist without a body. So Maqasid cannot exist without Usul, right? And the Usul itself does not stand and have any spirit, right, without Maqasid. So I want to cover for a few minutes. This is a long conversation, but the history of how this science developed, I find it to be extremely important. Again, to the reason I mentioned in the beginning is that people often think this is a modern science, and they think this is something which liberals and progressives only promote. But I'll argue that actually from the time of the Sahaba, actually from the time of the Prophet, you would actually say, but specifically from the Sahaba to the 5th century was kind of where you had the initial ideas about utilizing certain frameworks that incorporate maqasid into them. So one of those is even the topic of qiyas, which was mentioned a few weeks ago. But in order to understand qiyas, you have to think about the purpose of Allah. So if one is trying to derive the illah, what is the underlying root cause of why an act is given a certain ruling? Well, that requires you to actually think about the maqasid. To give an example, imagine somebody was saying, why is alcohol prohibited? And they want to make qiyas now with something else. So someone says, well, what does, so let me give you an example. Someone might ask about, well, can I drink apple cider? And I said, okay, well, I don't know. There's no hadith on drinking apple cider. So I say, well, if I make qiyas, well, alcohol is clear and kind of brownish, and so is apple cider. So there is something which they share in common. But of course, that's a ridiculous conclusion to make, that you can make the analogy on apple cider and alcohol, because the cause of alcohol being prohibited has nothing to do with its color or its translucence, right? It has to do with the fact that it intoxicates. So if you cannot understand the illah, you cannot derive an illah if you don't understand maqasid kind of as a framework, that why would Allah give that ruling on something? If you can fully understand that, then you can understand qiyas. And the Shafi'i in al-Risala, he's the one who really, in the, when he did this in the earlier generations, he set that foundation for a number of centuries, that people took his work as being kind of the go-to when it came to understanding qiyas and ilal, and that kind of persisted for a number of centuries. Then we hit a point in the 5th century where two great Shafi'i jurists, Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni and Imam al-Ghazali, they began to delve deeper into this. So in the 5th century, what they had done, first it was al-Juwayni, who's a teacher of Ghazali. He is the one who categorized that the Maqasid of Sharia, the objectives of the law, he said there are 5 fundamental objectives. And he began to, and Ghazali and him both elaborated on the levels that objectives can be classified by. And we'll cover both of these in the upcoming slides. But they began to provide a framework that the law has these 5 really important things it's trying to achieve. And those can be achieved at 3 different levels, which they'll call that which is necessity, which is general need, and that which is kind of an embellishment. So that was their contribution. There was, of course, more, but that's kind of the foundational work. And to give some examples of that, you find, actually, I'll wait for a few slides and I'll give those examples. The next century, you find 2 other scholars who began to speak about maqasid from a different angle. This is Imam al-Razi and Imam al-Amidi. So both of these, of course, are well-known usulis. In their great books of usul, al-Mahsul by Razi and al-Ihkam by Amidi, they wrote quite a bit about what is maslaha, how do you consider a maslaha in a ruling, and then when would you use maslaha in a specific circumstances. So al-Amidi in particular, in his book al-Ihkam fi Usul al-Ihkam, he wrote a lot about how you use maslaha, meaning public benefit, how do you use what's beneficial in making tarjih. So he was the first to actually really get explicit about, well, how does this now trickle down into specific decisions of a jurist? Is this going to be permitted or not permitted? And how do I think about maslaha as overriding something that might have any other problems in it? Then you see the next generation, you see the student of al-Amidi. And it's important to see the relationship between the students. Juwayni was a teacher of Ghazali, right? Al-Amidi was a teacher of Al-Izz ibn Abdul Salam. And so you see that the student would pick up on where the teacher left off and really begin to build it out. And the names that I'm sharing with you here are, of course, not the only ones who worked in this field, but I purposely picked some of the most well-known and well-respected to show that they are the ones who really built this science from the ground up. And so Al-Izz ibn Abdul Salam and Imam al-Qarafi, who was, Imam al-Qarafi was also a student of Al-Izz ibn Abdul Salam, they really opened the door on the topic of maslaha. So Al-Izz ibn Abdul Salam, he wrote a 2-volume book on maslaha completely. It was just simply a categorization of maslaha. And to be honest, it's probably one of the best books that I've ever read in Usul al-Fiqh. And then al-Qarafi in his book Al-Furuq, which was where he was trying to really speak more about qawaid fiqhiyah, legal maxims. He also built upon these prior, the works of his prior teachers. And then you have, towards the 8th century, Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim. And they're, of course, from the Hanbali tradition. So whereas the Shafi'is did a lot of the development in Maqasid early, right? The Hanbalis and the Malikis also did a lot later on. And as I'll get to Shatibi's, the next one. But Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim, they kind of picked up where they think the the earlier fifth, the jurists left off. So they went all the way back to, you'd say, the 5th century. And they began to look at qiyas and ilal from a very different angle. And they made a few strong points that the Sharia actually never violates, that no opinion of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would violate qiyas. So Ibn Qayyim does this quite a bit in his books of Usul. And then Ibn Taymiyyah does a lot on hiyal, on legal loopholes, like I mentioned earlier. Then we get to the late 8th century, and I'll stop with this for the history, where the great Maliki jurist and mujtahid Imam al-Shatibi, he wrote in al-Muwafaqat, he really took everything that was done prior to him, from the 5th to the 8th century, and he organized it into a very structured fashion. And he then fused it into Usul. And when I say fuse it into Usul, he made it like within his chapters in Usul, he would incorporate Maqasid, the ideas, to train the jurist how to think from this dual lens. That how do you think about the sources of law and keep that cap on your head? And how do you also think about the Maqasid while interpreting the sources of law at the same time? So Shatibi really was kind of his book, Al-Muwafaqat, is considered to be the most unique written in Usul from a Maqasidi lens. And it is studied to this day in universities all over the world. So we'll take that. So then we go to the derivation of the Maqasid. So one might ask, okay, this sounds great. This deen is built on objectives and pillars. It has objectives that are noble. It's trying to achieve benefit and harm. But where do we get these from? Right? Is it just that the jurist makes them up? And what you find is statements of the classical usulis that say no, that comprehensive evaluation was a method that was used. It's called al-istiqra' at-tam. It's like doing a very comprehensive literature review. So through their analysis and assessment of all the ayat of the Quran and all the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they find that the laws that are in there, they were not random. They were not just saying do this and then there was really no purpose behind them. It's that comprehensive evaluation is what told them that the law seems to have this purpose of benefiting the creation, because there's no laws in the Quran or the Sunnah that were harmful and detrimental to the human being. And then Shatibi, he says this again as well. He says the reliable position, meaning in the Maliki school or in the school of Usul, is that we did an exhaustive evaluation and found that the laws were placed in order to benefit humanity. And then he makes this point. It's kind of a funny point. He says this comprehensive evaluation is not argued against by Razi or anyone else. And the reason he said this is Razi argues about everything, right? And he's a philosopher as much as an Usuli. So he's saying that even those who are the most critical and who might question everything would agree with this statement, that if you do an exhaustive evaluation of the laws, you will find that there is a very clear purpose to benefit humanity. And then another statement was said, and I think this is by, I think this is by Juwaini. He said, the laws have only been legislated for the maqasid of humanity. As for this fact that laws are legislated to achieve the objectives and wisdom of Allah, then the evidence for this is ijma' and common sense. And then I'll give some examples from the Prophet's own life and the Quran. You see that certain principles are derived that tell you that there's a purpose. So one of them, for instance, is lifting of hardship, raf'ul haraj. There are dozens and dozens of ayat and hadith where you find that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ sees people in a situation of hardship, and the rulings then get adjusted in order to not put people in that, in order to maximize their benefit as well. So I'll give some examples, right? If somebody, so when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is telling the companions to shorten the prayers when traveling, what is the purpose behind such an act, right? Or what is the purpose behind offering tayammum as an alternative when there's no water, right? What is the why are there rukhas, right? Why are there concessions that one can, for instance, eat pork if they need that to survive, or eating even carrion, right? Some roadkill. If one was to say, well, look, the law is the law. I cannot eat roadkill. It was not dhabiha. I will die on this. That is not what Islam is advocating for us to do. Why? Because hardship is meant to be lifted because it's trying to achieve a greater purpose. And I'll get to that greater purpose in a minute. But you see that those hundreds of ayat and hadith, you say dozens, but probably hundreds, will show us that. The other example from the Prophet's life that shows us that there's an objective to the law is at-tadarruj, gradualism. So when the law came, and it initially had alcohol being suggested as something which is just, it has some good and it has bad, all right, and it's kind of just being left there. And Allah did not forbid it. Then we were told not to drink when we are in a state of, not to be drunk or intoxicated while we're praying. And then eventually salah became prohibited. Well, you'd say, well, why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gradually do things? And the answer that would make sense, that there's a purpose in doing that, and that the human being itself will not achieve the benefit of those laws unless you do it in such a fashion. This is why Aisha said in that hadith that if the Prophet Muhammad came first, right, and he told us not to commit zina and to leave alcohol, we would not do it. So to achieve a purpose is what Allah is trying to do, and the laws will be legislated over time in a certain manner to allow that to happen. So fasting is similar, salah is similar. There are many things that Allah gradually gave the Sahaba in order to achieve the purpose of those acts of worship. And now we go into the specifics now. So I mentioned previously that there was 5 objectives that I'll get to in the next slide. But before that, what Juwayni and Ghazali have argued was that we need to think about the law from 3 different levels. So any law you should be able to classify as being either something which is necessary, absolutely fundamentally part of the human experience, that without a law that addresses it, we would be in extreme hardship, and that's called the daruri. So that's universal necessities. The second level, which is a lower level, right, is which is called al-hajiyat, right? It's a general need, right? If you don't have a law that facilitates that practice, people will be in some hardship, but life can persist. And the lowest level is what's called enhancements or embellishments, called at-tahsiniyat. So these are things that really, really perfect life, and laws that facilitate full thriving. But without them, people could still survive. It would just be less than optimal. And so some examples of that is like tahara, right? Like certain rules of tahara, like if one does not wash themselves according to the guidance of Islam when using the restroom, their life will still go on, right? Like it's an enhancement that's made to really honor the human being, to be a clean person who's able to stand before Allah in a certain way and also interact with their human beings in another way. So that is something which is not a universal necessity, but it is an enhancement, right? Etiquettes of eating are another example, right? That you eat with your right hand, right? That you say Bismillah. These are all enhancements on our life. So if we go to those 5 objectives, so from this categorization of universal necessities, general needs, and enhancements, life is built upon this lowest category, right? This universal necessities. And so what are those things that Islam is saying have to be preserved in a society, that have to be developed and have to be able to thrive? And so you find Al-Juwayni, he said it was these 5. And this is, again, I will explain why. He said that the Sharia, by definition, is seeking to ensure that these 5 domains are preserved and developed and enhanced. And he said that was the preservation of life, preservation of iman, of faith, preservation of wealth, preservation of intellect, and the preservation of lineage. And we can give examples of all these in the upcoming slides, but one might ask, well, why these 5? How did Juwayni decide that these 5 were to be kind of those major kind of principal objectives of the Sharia? And so he explained. So Al-Juwayni, what he said was that he derived these based upon him looking at the hudud. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's very few capital punishments in Islam, right? You think about what the capital punishments are, right? If you kill somebody, right, then there's capital punishment for that, right? If one, leaves the faith in certain circumstances, there's a punishment for that. If one gets drunk, right? The Sahaba, they had put together a whipping for that. For adultery, right, there's something, and for theft, there's cutting of the hands. So there's very few things where there is a had, a capital punishment for. So Juwayni said that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is willing to penalize a sin to that level, then that is violating what is a universal necessity of life, of society. So for instance, taking life cannot simply be a sin between one and Allah, right? Like if I was to lie to somebody, or if I was to, or even disobey my parents, even though those are big sins, it's not something which is going to undermine the foundation, right, of society, and that's something which society is unable to function now. But if murder is allowed to go, and it's just a sin between one and Allah, then that is very, very problematic. So Allah puts a capital punishment to preserve the sanctity of life in a society. When it comes to even things like drugs and alcohol, people who engage in those practices, the most fundamental human tool that honors a human being is his intellect. And to compromise the ability of the intellect to think clearly, whether it be short-term or long-term, again, violates kind of the sanctity of society. And same thing with adultery, that adultery there's a capital punishment for it because it fundamentally destroys the lineage of a society, right? And the relationships between society. And then theft, right? The hand of the thief will be cut off, because if wealth can be taken without any punishments or consequences, right, then the economic system of society cannot thrive. This was Juwayni's argument. He says these five, he said, are the exclusive highest level objectives because Allah had put a capital punishment for them. And then he said again, we know that these are the five from our observations of divine custom. And then you had Imam al-Qarafi, just to give a little bit of the difference of opinion out there in Maqasid. He actually said there was a sixth. And he says that honor is a sixth one, that society's honor has to be preserved. And he said that there are punishments in Islam for those who accuse people falsely, right? So in Surah An-Nur, we have numerous ayat about the punishments for those who put forth false accusations to people. So he added a sixth. It's debated. One can say there's five, one can say there's six. There's nothing sacred about these. And Ibn Taymiyyah actually took it a step further, and he said actually they should not be restricted. And he actually enumerated on dozens and dozens of them. But I would argue that Ibn Taymiyyah's definition was meant to be far more broad, in saying that these were not about being just about fundamental things, but he was saying that there are things that the Sharia generally should be considered as objective. So he mentions like brotherhood, right? He mentions so many other things that are out there. But that's just kind of to tell you why we generally think about these five, but one doesn't have to limit it to those five at all. Let's look at the time so I know where okay. Yeah, actually, maybe this is a good time. Yeah, do you want to stop for a few minutes and do questions, or should we just push it off again to the end?
Yeah, we can go ahead and do it at the end of this session, inshallah.
Okay, no problem. And just so I'm clear, I'm supposed to stop at 11, correct? All right.
You technically have to 11:20 because we usually do the last 40 minutes for questions.
Oh, got it. Okay, 11:20. Perfect. Okay. Bismillah. Okay, so we continue, and I just want to give some examples of, again, where does Allah, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they did introduce the logic behind the rulings explicitly in numerous ayat and hadith in the Quran. And I'm going to show you this just to tell you that the Prophet was trying to train the Sahaba to think about the purpose behind rulings, because rulings aren't meant to be thought of as these random tests from Allah where he says do or don't do and we don't understand why and we're just supposed to follow it blindly. Yes, we follow it even if we don't know the logic, but we should try and seek to understand that logic. So one example is there was a man who was trying to get the Prophet's attention, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he peeped into the Prophet's house, alayhi wasallam, and the Prophet at that time was in his house and he was combing his hair with a metal comb. And so the Prophet, when he found out, I don't know if he heard the noise outside, but then when he saw the man, he said that, had I known that you were peeking into my home, he said that I would have poked you, right, I would have stabbed you essentially with my iron comb in your eye. Right? And then he said, إِنَّمَا جُعِلَ الْإِسْتِئْذَانُ مِنْ أَجْلِ النَّظَرِ or مِنْ أَجْلِ الْبَصَرِ. He says that seeking permission to enter into people's houses was done for the sake of one's eyesight. Meaning that, like, look, you peep into my house, you might see something that's inappropriate, right? Meaning that what if I'm not dressed properly? What if one of my wives is not dressed properly, right? Looking into people's homes is he said, والسلام, the reason is to preserve, right, is your eyes and not to see that which is inappropriate. Now, one could add to it, it's also going to be so the people's honor in the household is not violated. But the point is the Prophet is explaining to the person why you can't do that. So don't look into my house because you might see something that you shouldn't be seeing. Then you find in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he speaks about capital punishment for murder, he says, وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاةٌ. He says that in retribution is life, meaning is a saving of life. Ya ulil albab. Right? So Allah is telling us that the purpose for the law of retribution is in order to save more lives. And so when you understand that purpose, then the law will change. This is why Juwayni, when he spoke about this, and we spoke about last week as well, when scholars would override not override, but kind of expand the ruling of a nas. So when Umar bin Khattab took those people from Sana'a and he killed the group of them that murdered one man, right? It was argued that, well, how can that be done? Well, the Quran says, an-nafsu bin-nafs, right? You can only kill one soul if that soul has taken another life. And so what Juwayni said is that the purpose of saving lives will be lost. if 10 people can kill one person and get away with it, he goes, we're going to have to execute all 10 because that is how the lives will actually be preserved. So you can see how their understanding of the nusus, their application of a law, was based upon what is it trying to achieve. And then you have, for instance, the prohibition of gambling. And I'm not saying these are like explicit maqasid. I'm just saying that Allah is giving us and the Prophet ﷺ some insight into what do we benefit by those rulings. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that Satan only wants to cause between you animosity and hatred through intoxicants and gambling and to avert you from the remembrance of Allah. So Allah is telling us that one of the reasons why we don't gamble is because that begins to sow animosity and hatred between people. Now, of course, there's other reasons for it. So I'm not saying that's the illah of the prohibition, right? That's not the cause of it, but it's definitely one of the reasons why we don't engage in this behavior, beyond, of course, throwing wealth and all kinds of other things that one could argue. So I'm sharing this with you because it helps one begin to change, to frame their mind that, okay, every law has a purpose. Some of those laws, I will understand the purpose, and some of them I will not. But now, how do I begin to organize those purposes in my own mind? And this is where we get to what Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam spoke extensively about, which is thinking about it. The first way that you can do it is to think about what level is that ruling being given at. So if we were to say at the most basic level, all of the Sharia is either achieving benefit, which is masalih, or it is warding off and preventing mafasid, which are harms. Well, you would say Allah has given us 5 rulings. There's al-hukm al-taklifi, right? We have 5 of these. We have al-wajib, al-mandub, and mubah fall into that which there are masalih. And we have haram and makruh where there are mafasid. So let's be very clear. So the greatest of maqasid are typically found in that which is wajib. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He wants to achieve maximum benefit, something which is fundamentally important to society, Allah will make that a wajib. And something which there is some lower level of benefit, that'll be mandub. And that which has even less benefit will be mubah. Now, within each of these, there are grades. So to give an example, and I know it's a little bit debated, but let's just say, so salah. There is no doubt that salah is wajib according to every single Muslim on the face of the earth, right? 5 daily salawat. So these 5 salawat that are not just wajib, but they're also considered from the, from the foundation, the Arqam al-Islam, right? The 5 pillars of Islam. They are far higher on their importance and the benefit they achieve than, for instance, the lowest wajib. Like imagine if someone said that the beard was wajib, right? If that's an opinion that a jurist holds, because there's evidence for it. No one would say that the beard and the salah are equal in what they're trying to achieve and in the reward that there is in there, and that their benefit to society. One would say no, that the salah is way higher, and at the very bottom of the wujub, right, you might have like a beard as an example, right? And the same thing goes for that which is mandub, right? You have things that are sunnah that are the very top of the sunnah, right? Let's say Salatul Witr might be an example of a very high sunnah that's right below a wajib. And then maybe at the very bottom of it, you have something like using a miswak. So you can begin to see that if you think about what ruling an action has, you can begin to think about how important Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deems that act. And it's also important because, as Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, he mentions that two behaviors that are exactly the same have 2 massively different rewards depending on whether that behavior is a wajib or a mandub behavior. So I'll give you an example. If someone was to recite the Quran in their salah, that is something which is a wajib. And so the recitation in the salah gets far greater the reward than the recitation that one does just kind of outside of salah as part of the nawafil, right? As that which is recommended. It's mandub, it's rewarded. And the same thing to any other act of worship that could be done. $1 that you've given zakah, that's $1 that you've given because you've been obligated to do it, is far more weighty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the $1 that you've given sadaqah that is voluntary at this point. Right? And then you go and you can think about the same for the haram, right? The haram are grades and the makruh are grades. I'll give you one example where I saw a ridiculous attempt of somebody to mishmash these together. Someone was trying to argue a few weeks ago whether you're a fan of Khabib, the MMA wrestler, right? This comes up. So, this very practicing Muslim, right, was the world champion in MMA, right, mixed martial arts. And so there was a sister who wrote an article on an Islamic website saying that, well, this guy engages in a haram sport, and thus what he does is akin to prostitution and all kinds of other sins that she mentioned. So, subhanAllah, even if one was to say that act was haram, which is to fight people in this fashion and to punch somebody in the face, would you say that hurma is a prohibition on the same level as prostitution? And the way to answer that is to look at the harm that they create out of it. So Al-Izz ibn Abd salam, when he gave his tafsir of what are major and minor sins, he said that one perspective you could have is that you can just say, well, the Prophet said that there are, these major sins, and you just classify those. And he argued that no, sins should be classified on their consequences. So that which is a major sin is a sin that has a huge level of detriment to society. And that which is a minor sin is a sin that has a far lower level of detriment to society. And one of the evidence that he used for this, he said that, do you not see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give the exact same act for two different people, gets a different punishment or a reward. And so if you look in Surah Al-Ahzab, Allah says, Ya Nisa an-Nabi, right? He says, oh, wives of the Prophet, that you are not like any other women, right? And then what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in those ayat? Ya Nisa an-Nabi, may ya'ti minkum bifahishatin mubayyinatin yudha'af laha al-'adhab ضعفين wa kana dhalika 'ala Allah yasira. He says, oh, wives of the Prophet, that if any of you were to come with a manifest sin, something that a fahisha, something really immoral and inappropriate, that the sin would be doubled for you. Now, one might argue, how could Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala double the sin on the Prophet's wives for doing something immoral? Aren't we all the same? And the argument that Al-Izz gives, and many other scholars, is no. That if somebody in a prominent position, if an imam, if a scholar, if a sahabi who is in a higher level, or the wives of the Prophet who are at a status of ummahat al-mu'mineen, if they do something openly sinful and immoral, the effect on society is far more detrimental. Right now, I'll give you an example. If a scholar did something haram publicly, not in private, publicly, then people will begin to say, oh, well, that act must not be so bad. And they'll begin to engage in that act far more than if a random person did it by themselves. So what you find is that it's not only that by Allah's ruling that things vary in their maslaha and their mafsada, but the person who's doing it, that ruling can change for them as well, whether they're of status or not, because the detriment of their behavior is tied to their social standing. Right? Wallahu a'lam. So we get to, now we get into some trickier stuff. We begin to merge into how does this operate within ijtihad? How do we begin to think about utilizing the science of maqasid and the principles of benefit and harm in a decision-making process? And inshallah, Abu Tariq will cover some of this differently when he talks about ijtihad. But the first is to talk about who can do this. So the only person who can practice ijtihad, according to Imam Shatibi and others, they should know both the maqasid really, really well, this ilm, and they should also know the details of Usul al-Fiqh. So you got to know hukum shar'i, you got to know hukum al-taklifi, al-hukum al-wada'i, adilla lughawiyya, all the linguistic things, and the legal address from the different standpoints. And you need to understand what is a law trying to achieve. And if you can do both of these, you can even begin to perform ijtihad. Now, one might then ask, well, then where does maqasid fit into this entire process of Islam? So I actually wanted to just kind of delineate this. I try to make this is my own attempt to frame this. So if one was to think about Islam, you would say Islam is two things. There's aqidah, right? And there is, legal issues. And so if you break these two up, from legal issues, you would say that maqasid, or the spirit of the law, would get its own classification. And that's all, masalih and mafasid. And then the code and theory is another science or a sub-science. That includes the sources, primary, secondary, and then linguistics and semantics. So this realm here would be, right, I'm sorry, my mouse right here, this would be the maqasid section, right, the spirit. So clearly one cannot be practicing law without knowing both sides of it. It seems, I like the statement that other scholars have made, that the Christians really think about the spirit of laws, but they have no code and theory. So that's why their legislation is batil completely, because everything is just about, what is the spirit trying to say? And they can override anything anytime they want. And then the Jews actually have the opposite. Sometimes they're so dogmatic in the code and the theory that the spirit of the law is completely lost. And they actually have to resort to all kinds of crazy loopholes. I'll give you an example of a loophole that I just found to be hilarious. that you might not be aware, in the city of Manhattan and in other cities in the US, there's actually a string that goes around the entire city. And you can look this up. I forgot, there's a name for that string. And the reason that the Jews, they do this in Manhattan is that, they're not supposed to leave their homes on the Sabbath. And that's just too difficult for them, right? They just feel like they have to. And so they put this string around the entire city. I forgot how many meters above the ground it's hovering, to act as the boundaries of their home, essentially, right? So you see all kinds of crazy loopholes being done, right, when one doesn't think about, their law in a complex and a dynamic way. And now we finally get to merging into, like, more and more specifically, how does this fit into the derivative process of law, right? Everything still has been very high level. It's not particular. And Imam al-Qarafi, I believe he did the best job of really tying Usul and Maqasid to Qawaid Fiqhiyah, to legal maxims. And he stated in his book that the Usul of Sharia, not Usul al-Fiqh, but the Usul of Sharia globally, he said, would be broken down into the technical Usul that we've been covering in this course for the last 16 weeks. And then he said universal legal maxims. And what he said about those universal legal maxims is that they were derived from an understanding of the Maqasid. So these legal maxims that the jurist has to use on a daily basis when coming up with law are themselves derived from the science of Maqasid. And so he said these principles are applied to both achieve the intent of the Maqasid and to prevent any abuse or misunderstanding that may result from over-relying on general principles. So they act as a safeguard for both angles. If you have a legal maxim, it allows you to achieve something which the mujtahid thinks the law is trying to achieve. It also prevents the mujtahid from perhaps over-relying on a general principle and ignoring certain evidences that he or she may not believe should apply in that case. And so we'll give you some examples of those now. So let's talk about, I have one more slide, then we'll go to the examples. And so Qarafi, he continued, and he mentioned that the Usul of Sharia are two branches. He said the first is Usul al-Fiqh, which is primarily comprised of fundamental legal principles based on linguistic considerations. So we've been talking about in this course. And then he said the second branch is Qawaid Kulliyah Fiqhiyah, universal legal maxims, which he said are distinguished, plentiful, far-reaching, and comprised from the secrets of the legislation and its wisdom. And then he said, in every legal maxim, there is much that has not been mentioned in Usul Fiqh. These maxims are very important in fiqh, extremely beneficial, and the true worth of a jurist is based on the extent of one's knowledge of these maxims. So let's share some of those maxims that jurists utilize regularly. One of them is matters are based upon their intent and objective. So that's the very first principle that you find in any textbook on Qawaid Fiqhiyah is that al-umur bi maqasidiha, right? We think about things based upon their intent and their objective. And by extension of that, there's another one that is specific for transactions, where it says that the considerations in transactions are based upon their intent and meanings, not on words and expressions. Now, this is important. You see this in Islamic finance today. People can take the exact same ribawi contract that's based in interest, do nothing but cross out the word interest and write something else over it, and they now consider this to be an Islamic contract. Why? Because there's no interest in it. But the function, the form, the intent, the payments 100% mirror and mimic the interest-based contract. So one would say that, well, what kind of law is this? Well, we're not going to look at just the words. You can rename something as interest. I don't care as non-interest if you want. If it acts as interest, when we're going to rule upon it as being interest. Right? Another beautiful qaida that has to be used to prevent abuse is that there is no resorting to ijtihad in the presence of a definitive legal text. And I'm listing these out. These are actually maxims that you would find like in a book of law, right? That jurist studies to say, okay, I need to apply this in a certain context. So la musagha lil ijtihad fi mawrid an-nas, right? So if there is a definitive legal text that says that something must be done, one cannot say, well, I think that I need to do something else and I cannot resort to ijtihad. There's no room for the person there, right? Because the law has closed that off. Then another rule is the repelling of harm takes precedence over the realizing of benefit. And this again is very important because sometimes, as Al-Izz ibn Abdul Salam said, he goes, benefit and harm is very hard to quantify because very few things in life are purely beneficial or purely harmful. And if that's the case, any laymen can figure that out. But when you start to get into things where there is slightly more benefit or slightly more harm, or they're equal in harm and benefit, that's where the jurist has to really think about, okay, if things are equal, and that's in many, many cases, you might think about that, where there is a potential for harm, the potential for benefit, well, what should I advocate for? Should I try to achieve the benefit, even if the harm is part of that process? Or should I make sure I push off the harm and leave off the benefit as well? So al-Izz and most of the scholars of Qawaid Fiqhiyya, they put this principle that the repelling of an equal harm takes precedence or the realizing of that benefit, of a benefit. And then they have another principle of difficulty necessitates ease. So like I mentioned previously, all of those ayat and all those hadith where the Prophet gave us rukhas, concessions, and the Quran began to make things easier in certain ways. When things get too difficulty, you see the law constantly facilitating, right, for the human being to achieve what should be done, even if it be in a less than optimal sense. Like I said, shortening prayers is different, right? Making tayammum is not like wudu, but the law facilitates because of the circumstances that people might be in. And then there's the famous hadith, la darra wa la dirar, there's no initiating of harm or reciprocating harm. And then if two detrimental things collide, avoiding the greater harm is of priority. So again, like I mentioned, if you know Maqasid and you see two harmful things that you cannot avoid, well, now how do you prioritize which one to engage in? And again, I'll mention that this is really, there's a lot of details to this. It's not as simple as somebody saying, well, I think that Trump is better than Biden or Biden is better than Trump, and just kind of haphazardly throwing things out. But really, really, this is supposed to have ghalabatul dhann. You're supposed to have documented very clearly where would the greater harm be, and make sure that you're exhaustive in thinking about it. It cannot be through a very narrow perspective or something which thinks about the individual's benefit, or has to think about society generally at large. So I'm going to link now. So these are all the maxims, and these maxims get actualized and get internalized within certain sources that we spoke about last week. So many of the sources in traditional usul are the result of infusing the maqasid into the core framework of source methodology. So these sources, as we spoke about last week, are often differed upon between the madhahib, but remember that they are primarily employed to achieve those benefits and those harms that the Sharia has outlined. So when we spoke last week about blocking the means, saddu dhari'ah, and opening the means, and istihsan, right? And we didn't talk about urf and maslaha mursala, but just to give, those are other ones. Al-maslaha mursala, just to give a definition, is an unrestricted public interest that a jurist would think about, how do I give a law that achieves benefit in which there's no textual authority in. So an example of that would be when the Sahaba decided to gather the Quran. That is, according to the jurists, they classify that as maslaha mursala, because there's no ayah and there's no hadith that told them to get the Quran and put it in a book. But they did it because they saw that it was in the public's benefit to do it, as the hufad were possibly, if they might die off for different reasons. So without a legal text to give them that, they used the idea of public benefit to engage in that practice. So the secondary sources are fundamentally, at their core, often meant to allow for maqasid to come into the jurist's framework. And then we get into, we spoke a little bit about last week, and I'll reiterate that the jurist then must think about in their ijtihad or fatwa, what is the consequence of their own opinion? And so the proper mujtahid not only employs a sound process, but also then checks whether or not that process leads to a sound result. Because if the opinion seems to be like, fine, that looks good, but it leads to something very, very harmful, then the jurist would not do it. And like we said last week, the Prophet did this many times, where he would turn down doing something that he thought as having maslahah because it led to some greater mafsada. So he mentioned the idea he did not kill the hypocrites that lived amongst him for fear that it would lead to the greater harm of jeopardizing the dawah and the public perception of Islam. Where he did not destroy the Kaaba and did not rebuild it on the pillars of Ibrahim because of the harm that it might create in the people that he was living with. So there's a lot of ways that the mujtahid should really think through that, not just am I using a derivative process that makes sense, but is the result that this process is going to lead to something which we consider to be advantageous or detrimental. And so the soundness of any legal opinion or law should be evaluated based upon what it is likely to achieve. And so like I mentioned, the Sunnah, it establishes this. And then Ahmadi, I'll go back to saying, he discussed this quite a bit in his book when discussing the in tarjih, so in legal preference. He said, okay, if there is a circumstance where following the usul will violate, for instance, the preservation of life, the preservation of intellect or of wealth or anything else, then he would argue that in what case can you override a juristic opinion because it's leaving out, it's not achieving a core objective of the law. And so I'll give an example of how a jurist might think about this as the Quran trained us to think about it. So like I mentioned, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ were in the business of training the analytical mindset to incorporate all of these things. So I think about this almost from an economic perspective. It's the jurist is performing a cost-benefit analysis of harms and benefits. So here's an example. One might wonder about alcohol and say, okay, well, Islam forbids alcohol. Why does it forbid alcohol? What does the Quran say about alcohol? Well, the Quran says, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ. They ask you about alcohol, right, and gambling. قُلْ فِيهِمَا إِثْمٌ كَبِيرٌ. Say, in it, there is a lot of harm, right? But there's also not just that. قُلْ فِي إِثْمٌ كَبِيرٌ وَمَنَافِعُ لِلنَّاسِ. But there's also benefit to people. So Allah is not negating that alcohol has some good and it has bad. But which is heavier? And if you look clearly, I mean, this is something which you could anyone can come up with, but alcohol has so many detrimental things to society. It can cause cancer, it can cause, it leads to violence, leads to drunk driving, it impairs your judgment. I mean, it leads to animosity and hatred. There's so many things that are bad about alcohol. Whereas on the good side, right, of course, fun is kind of a silly one I put there because people argue that, well, it's just so fun. But let's say somebody said that alcohol was good for the heart, right? Half a cup of wine or a cup of wine a day. You'll see different published studies that say that it could be good for your heart. Interestingly, as I've thought about this over years, the scientific literature on the benefits of drinking have now come out far more clear in saying that whatever benefit there is, the harm is so much greater. So they actually don't no longer really push for like any sort of beneficial drinking. But my point is that what Allah was showing us here was to weigh the benefit and the harm, and not to have a narrow perspective saying, well, there's something good in this, so then we must do it. But if you holistically look at something, right, and you look for the underlying causes, the illah in this case, right, that you will find that that's what drives what the ruling should be. So in this case, despite the possible benefits, the overriding harms lead to it being prohibited, and at a very serious level. And so I know I'm at a few more minutes. I'm going to close in just a minute or two. Is the last few statements I want to make, because I worry that after what I've said, that people say, well, this sounds so great and so dandy, and now like this should just be like we should not obsess over all the details, right? And we're going into the intricacies of the the al-Shari'ah and the taklifi and the wad'i, and whether this is the source methodology. Just use Maqasid. And I really, really want to caution against that. And I like to close on this, that as beautiful as Maqasid are, the Maqasid of Sharia as a science, they are like a torch that I think illuminates and enlightens one's understanding of this faith of ours. But if one doesn't have deep expertise in Usul and a respect for the tradition and the scholarship that has developed our legal methodology, any attempt of incorporating Maqasid into lives and into law will burn and destroy the Sharia down, right? So fire, right? Fire has the ability to illuminate and to do wonderful things. But if you give if you give fire to a baby, right, they're going to burn themselves most likely. So if one is not deeply steeped in the legal tradition, this is something that just cannot be done. And I'll close with, I'm actually just going to read something that I liked. I got this from Dr. Akram Nadwi. He wrote a bit about this, and I just want to read what he said because I think it encapsulates my thoughts perfectly. He said, "What I fear is going on in the issue of in the use to which the concept of maqasid is being put in our time." So his fear of maqasid is the same fear he has to what has been done with modern tafsir. He says the modern commentator might find an idea or sentiment that appeals to them and which they are convinced will lead to an improvement in people's understanding and behavior. And then they claim that this is what the Quran is all about. So through a very narrow lens, they interpret the Quran based upon what they find to be kind of like a central theme in it. So they say so even if that is not at all what the Quran says. They say so even when they know that neither the Prophet nor his companions ever understood those words to mean any of those things, right? So today you see that in tafsir, people will say, well, this word means this. And you're like, okay, nobody in history has ever said that. No Sahabi, the Prophet, no scholar has ever interpreted the words of the Quran the way you are. And so you think that everyone got it wrong, except for you got it right? Like we see that today, that people advocate those understandings, especially with a lot of the progressives, right, that are out there, and especially in academia. So he says that what they could be doing is advocating that idea or sentiment that they believe in on the authority of their own reasoning and their own behavior. But he said, but they don't take any responsibility for that. Instead, they claim that this comes from the Quran. So in effect, they're claiming that this idea or sentiment is what Allah meant in the Quran, even when it was not. And so he continues, and I'm going to skip to the bottom of his sentence. He says that, give me a second. He says, the temptation to do this is not restricted to modern times when Muslims are politically weak in the world. Rather, it has existed throughout Islamic history from at least the time of the Mu'tazila. He says, nor is the temptation to do this restricted to very foolish or very clever people who wish to harm Islam or the Muslims. His little harm comes to Muslims from such people because their bad motives soon become obvious. And this is really the main point. The harm comes rather from the well-intentioned and pious Muslims who believe that by their interpretations, they are serving Islam and the Muslims. Despite their faith and piety, they find the Quran and Sunnah inadequate. So they find they are not inwardly satisfied with the mercy of Allah embodied in the Quran and the Sunnah. They think that these sources of Islamic faith, culture, and law need improving. In our time, the improving takes the form of calls for reformation and enlightenment on the lines of what has happened to other faiths like Christianity and Jews in the West. And he says, in the end, the heart of the issue is submission to Islam and accepting the boundaries of human autonomy and reason. And he says that he fears that, the last statement he made, he says, my fear is that the concept of Maqasid is liable to abuse in order to authorize and legitimize the adoption of norms and laws that have no sound basis in Islamic legal tradition. And because the Islamic legal tradition is an expression of Islam, I fear that contemporary misunderstanding of the concept of Maqasid is a danger to the faith as well as to the religion and culture, to Iman as well as Deen. So I know that was a heavy mouthful, but I will leave it at that and open it up for question and answers. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
Inshallah. I think I did forget it at the introduction. If you do still have questions, there is a user on the call named Q&A. Go ahead and message your questions to them. We're still taking questions, inshallah. The first question we have, okay, these seem related. Okay, so if a hukum goes against one maqsid or maqasid, but fulfills another, how do jurists, or what sort of prioritization exists? Could you speak to that a little bit more?
Repeat it. So if one hukum goes against one maqsad but achieves another?
Correct.
Yeah, so it'd be nice if someone had an example to think about, but in general, what is going to happen is that categorization of what's dururi versus a universal necessity versus kind of a general need versus an embellishment, that's the classification. So if a ruling achieves something which is, let's say, a general need, but violates a universal need, then you're not going to allow that ruling because you can't go for a lower benefit at the expense of a greater benefit. If they're both at the level of daruri and it achieves one and doesn't achieve the other, then we need to ask really, well, which one is like, that's problematic, but which one then takes precedent, right? Is it going to be life? Is it going to be intellect? So I would need a very specific answer to.
So the questioner gave the example, or just sent it in, of the punishment of apostasy. So in one case, you're protecting deen, but you're losing life.
Okay, got it. So again, the idea of all the maqasid, just to be very clear, they're meant to be operationalized at a societal level, right? They're not meant to be operationalized at an individual level. So of course, any law might cost somebody money. It might cost somebody, there's something which they might have to give up, especially in the case of a punishment, right? So we're not going to say that losing a life here is violating a maqsad, because it's not violating of life at a societal level. In this case, it's a capital crime. In the case of apostasy, it's a big topic to debate. But let's just say in the very clear-cut case where there's no difference of opinion, which is the case of a political apostate, right? Someone who goes into Islam, right, is privy to the secrets of the Muslims, then he leaves Islam and divulges that to the enemy. That's the most clear murtad that is to be assassinated, right? Or to be killed, I should say, right? The one who leaves Islam on his own, that's a whole debated thing. Ibn Taymiyyah has a lot on that. And many jurists say that he's not to be, leave him alone. And there's evidence from the Sunnah that you can leave these people alone, right? But in that case, you would say that, look, if this person goes into Islam, gets all the secrets of the Muslims, then goes and divulges it to the non-Muslims, this puts the Islamic society at a greater threat. The sanctity of their own life or their wealth or their society is under threat because of one person's behavior of going in and out of Islam. So eliminating that person is far less detrimental than the harm that person would have caused to society. So again, think about it not at your level, think about it at the level of the individual. So give a more clear example. Riba is a good example. Like when I put my money in an account that gets me interest, I'm benefiting, right? I'm personally benefiting. But at a societal level, something else is happening. And if I don't think about that at that macro level, then the maqasid are going to be completely broken. But at the macro level, I'm causing a lot of damage by being a part of this riba-based system. So that's how the jurist has to think about it. We don't look at do you benefit or do you harm? What does the behavior manifest for the society generally? Wallahu a'lam.
There's another question. So if a hukum goes against the maqasid, what should be done? Let me read that. So no one would deny the validity of such a hukum. So I'm assuming the questioner is asking for an established ruling found in the textual evidences, like Quran Kareem, for example. Mm-hmm. In this instant, what role does a maqasid play in an established rule from the Nas?
Yeah, great question. So there are a lot of different. There's two things. The first is that a valid opinion or not? That's the thing that has to be asked. So one might say, Ibn al-Qayyim might say that if that position, that at the time that it was given, okay, so if you say it's a nas, right? That means it's from the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? It's nas, it's a legal text, it's maybe definitive or not, right? But whatever, it's a legal text, and the Prophet says to do something. I'll give you a very clear example. In one narration, he said, al-bikr bil-bikr, he said that the one who commits zina, who premarital, essentially, not adultery, right? Then his punishment is to be whipped 100 times and expelled for 1 year. So the jurists were confused about this. So here's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he said that if somebody commits zina outside of marriage, then in a premarital circumstance, that they should be whipped 100 times and kicked out of the land for a year. So does this mean that, how do the maqasid come into play here? Well, the Maliki jurists said that, well, this is not definitive in exactly how it's manifested. So they said this only applies to men because you can't take young women and kick them out of the city for a year. He said that this rule can only apply to men. The Hanafis said the woman can be whipped, but she's not to be kicked out of the land, right? So what they're doing in this circumstance is that they're doing what's called takhsis an-nas bil maslaha. They said there's some benefit that is in the ruling that, well, there's some benefit in diverting from the clear statement that's there or from the apparent meaning of what's there. And you could almost argue this is a type of istihsan, and there's we spoke about that last week. There's, is this istihsan, sorry, bin nas, right, or something else. And how would you then leave, let's say, if you're going to make qiyas in that matter, or what other evidence would you use? So Juwayni says that you can use some general maqsad to frame the issue that you're talking about. So in that example, why the Malikis and why the Hanafis limit the extent of the Prophet's guidance to just men, right? Because they found that the maslaha, there's a greater mafsada if it applied to women. So that's an example of how they did that. The second question, or the second part of the answer is that, well, the nas itself is, if it's coming from the Quran and the Sunnah, what is the context behind it? And people often fail to look at context. Any statement of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Any event that he judged within, is he doing that in his capacity as a legislator that is general? Was he doing it as just a specific let's say, issue like in his role as a qadi, right? Is he doing it simply as a preference in a certain circumstance, or did he mean for that to be a general principle? Those are some debates that people have in usul when looking at a particular affair. Like the example I gave of the isbal in last week, that the general ruling was that, the Prophet said, don't let your pants, your izar go down low because, right, what's below the ankles is in hellfire. And then when Abu Bakr came along, he clarified. So you say, well, he's saying that because of the context. So those nusus, are we understanding them does the context of the nas apply to the context that we're in today? And I don't mean that by saying we can throw out a hadith and ayat whenever we want to. But if it doesn't, then how do you limit the meaning of the nas in that circumstance? And that's where you'd start to invoke those other secondary, legal sources to see, can you bound the extent by which that nas is used that allows it to achieve the maslahah that is within it, and make sure that you don't introduce any mafsada that could be introduced by using it out of context. Wallahu a'lam. I know it's a long-winded answer, but.
So we have two questions on just definitions. The first one is, what is tarjih? And the second one, and maybe I might have missed it if it was on the slide, but the sister can correct me if I'm wrong. What is hiyal?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. So tarjih means juristic preference. What that means is that if there are two valid opinions, I'll give you a very clear example, right? In any fiqh issue, today a mujtahid or any jurist says, I want to know what to do in this circumstance. And he goes to the books of fiqh and he sees that the Malikis say X and the Hanafis, they say Y, and the Shafi'is, they say Z, as an example. Let's say three examples in this case. How does the jurist pick which answer he thinks is most appropriate? This is called tarjih. So do they simply go with the easiest answer? Do they go with the most difficult answer? Do they go with the one that, and so these are the things that a jurist thinks about. How do they incorporate the usul to pick the preferred answer? And so, of course, within madahib, there's a difference of opinion on tarjih itself, but that's what tarjih is getting at. It's the methodology of preferring one opinion over another. The second question is, what is hiyal? Hiyal refers to, it's a plural of hila. Hila means a trick. So a trick in Islamic law is when you try to get around one law, right? By it's almost like you're playing a game, right? It's a legal loophole. So I gave that example of in last week from Ashab al-Sabt in the Quran, that this is a clear example of someone using a loophole that Allah criticized extensively when the Jews were forbidden from fishing on a Saturday. So they'd go out Friday night and they'd put out all their poles and their lines. And then, of course, Saturday morning, right, the fish bite, and they go and they pick them up right on Sunday morning, right? So they're doing their best to fish on Saturday by using a loophole. So hiyal have been long discussed in Islamic law. Sometimes they're used when, especially the Hanafis use them, when they find that something is hard to, the derivative process of usul is not leading to their outcome. And so they kind of find some other door to open that up. Now, they're not always bad. Although, like I mentioned, Ibn Qayyim, Ibn Taymiyyah, and the Malikis are very strict on hiyal because they find that the hiyal are violating the intent of the law at times. But that's what hiyal is all about.
Okay, inshallah. There's a question. The importance of maqasid was well demonstrated. I am just a little hung up on the cost-benefit analysis point. How do we operate on cost-benefit when some of the scholars of Usul have discussed maqasid from the perspective of both this life and the hereafter?
Yeah, it's a great question. Jazakallah khair. So the general ruling is that in ibadat, especially, maqasid are far less likely to be invoked because the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the purpose behind the details of an act of worship are far more difficult to ascertain. First, they require direct revelation to understand. That's like the first part. And the second part is that there's no human way of knowing whether or not that maqsad is being achieved the same way. So in business or in any sort of civil matter, you can see that what is the benefit of this law versus that law, right? I mean, even if you were to talk about something which is not explicitly religious, but like a speed limit, right? If I put a speed limit on one road and not on another road, I can directly measure the benefits and the harms that are being achieved of accidents versus people getting there on time, whatever it might be. But I cannot really ascertain that what is the benefit of Allah giving me 2 rak'ahs for Fajr and 4 rak'ahs for Dhuhr? Or why do I recite loudly in Fajr, Maghrib, and Isha, and not in Dhuhr and Asr. These are, it's tawqifiyah, right? Like it's there, we do it. There's a general benefit that we have around there that we know around Salah and these things, but the particulars we cannot fully understand. So we cannot invoke maqasid in playing with those. So no one could say, well, the maqsad of Fajr is, for instance, to like, to start your day, with remembering Allah. But, that was in classical times. It would get up at the crack of dawn because they didn't have light. And now that we have lights, it doesn't matter. We could sleep until 8 o'clock and get up, right? That's using maqasid in a bogus way, right? But one could say that in a financial transaction, this transaction that was practiced back then had a different, cost and a benefit on society, or a harm and a benefit. And the application of that same law today may not have it. So how can we limit the use of that law or expand the use of that law if the harm that was in the past is gone? Now I can open it up. Or if there's a benefit that was in the past that's no longer there, then I can close it up. So I think the easiest distinction is maqasid never really get deeply involved in ibadat as much as they get involved in mu'amalat and other things. Allahu a'lam.
Yeah, there's a question more on your sort of analysis of the current examples of the misuse of maqasid, whether just here in the West or globally.
Oh, you want examples?
Correct.
Yeah. So I mean, this gets tricky because again, this is all ijtihad and everyone has their own opinion. But there are some that we can talk about. So one that is debated, but I feel is a misuse of maqasid, is the opinion on dealing with interest in the West. So you find some scholars who permit purchasing of homes on riba through Bank of America or something else. And their argument is that riba is forbidden. That's the basic hukum they work with. But what they argue is that owning a home is a general need. And a general need, according to another legal maxim, is that they say al-haja tanzilu manzilat ad-durura, that a general need can take the ruling of a universal necessity. So they say that owning a home is practically a necessity, and so we will override in this temporary circumstance that one could engage in a riba-based contract in order to purchase your home. Allahu alam, I find this to be a very problematic use of maqasid. Right, very problematic. Number one is that it is debated whether or not owning a home is a necessity. Many people can survive, and their life is not under threat, and they're not losing out on some basic thing that you must have by renting. Right, that's one argument. Right, and there's a whole lot of others you can give. So that's one example. Another one that I think was prevalent this last year in Ramadan during COVID was praying Tarawih virtually. Right, and I know one great, I love the scholar. I think he's probably one of the best in the world. He gave this opinion himself, where he said that he felt that the purpose of Tarawih, right, in getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he felt that people who were stuck at home, who were unable to recite Quran very well or something else, they would lose out on that benefit. Right, so he felt that allowing this, despite the fact that all the rules of Salah about being in the same place, or being behind the Imam, so on and so forth, were not there. These are my own personal things where I find that people can use maqasid in different ways that may be too liberal and too open. But again, this is the realm of ijtihad. And like I mentioned last week, if the mujtahid does this with sincerity and with using a process that he believes is sound, even if he's wrong, he gets the ajr. Whereas somebody else who has no business in this space, gives some random opinions, and sometimes he's right and sometimes he's wrong, he's never going to be rewarded, right? So it's hard to say because the truth is only known to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
We have a question. Could you discuss the difference between an illah and hikmah again?
Yeah, sure. So the illah in qiyas is much more specific, that it is the actual cause that is underlying the ruling that you have. Right. So as an example, intoxication, right, would be considered, the illah, right, behind the prohibition, for instance, of like drugs and like alcohol, as an example, right? So, but there are many other wisdoms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are more general in why Allah would not have that. Like I mentioned, it could be that it leads to animosity, right? It could lead to hatred, right? It can lead to other sorts of health problems. So numerous hikam can exist, But the illah that we use in law is usually like one core thing. And you need to have that one core thing because that's what allows you to build any precedent off of, right? I can't take some potential hikam because, something could cause animosity, right? Or some hatred. But for me to use that secondary wisdom of Allah to make qiyas on something can be very, very problematic. So again, illah is like a legal definition of the root cause behind something, the ruling for something, whereas the hikmah is just kind of a spiritual or more general wisdom of Allah in the legislation of those actions. Allahu A'lam. And by the way, I know Abu Tariq is here, so he's welcome. Please, Abu Tariq, please turn your mic on and feel free to answer any of these questions. Your answers are probably better than mine.
There is a question. Perhaps I might have missed the disclaimer that the invocation of the maqasid only come in when the main sources of hukum, i.e. Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Qiyas, have been exhausted by the mujtahid. Can I confirm that this is something the speaker agrees with?
Can you repeat it one more time?
The invocation of maqasid only come in when the main sources of hukum, Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Qiyas, have been exhausted by the mujtahid. You can discuss application as well.
Yes. I would say no. The framework of maqasid is there when someone is interpreting the nusus as well. So whether you have a verse of the Quran or a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, or you're in the business of performing qiyas, if you ignore maqasid, you don't say, I'm going to take my maqasid cap on and only put it on when I don't have any evidence to work with. That's what maslaha mursala does. There's really no evidence there, right? But in this case, your lens, the interpretive lens of seeing the applicability of the nusus or the qiyas is inherently going to be shaped by the maqasid. So you say, what does this qiyas achieve, right? What does how does my derivation of the evidence in this hadith, what does it achieve, right? Because we mentioned previously, have you guys covered the linguistics of words?
In this course, no.
Yeah. So give you an example. So a word, let's say a word carries multiple meanings, which happens all the time in language, right? How do you know which meaning of the word to take? There's, of course, a lot of technical ways you can do that. But another thing one could think about is, well, what if I took meaning A of a word over meaning B? What is the consequence of that action? And so that's where even your process of making ijtihad on a verse or a hadith is being shaped by what is the consequence of one interpretation over another. So maqasid are going to be this overarching framework, but the overriding of using some general maslaha to override, a nas, that's going to come far, far later down the road, right? That's going to be only if the evidence that you gain from it is your conclusion, you find it to be against, what the law is trying to achieve. So this ayah, my interpretation leads to some bogus outcome. So I'm saying, well, must be something wrong with my interpretation. It's not the ayah that's wrong. So you have to go back into the dalala of it. So the thubut is something else, right? If it's authentic, it's authentic. But it's the dalala that we're arguing about, is what you're seeing in this makes sense or not. And the way we evaluate whether the way you see the verse or ayah or the hadith makes sense is it in line with what the law is trying to achieve? So I don't know if that clarifies, but that's kind of that's the way I would frame it.
And our last question is just generally, you had spoken about a difference in whether maqasid is a sub-science under Usul al-Fiqh or an independent science. So what are the implications of that discussion? And, if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. I think the implications of it, they can be serious depending on how the jurist is being trained. And I think this goes back to almost any other field where when you compartmentalize knowledge, what is the effect of that on the practice of an individual? So I'll give you just a general example, right? If I was to take mathematics, right, and I'd study math in one subject, and then I would study, science in another subject, and I never allow the two subjects to really merge together, and I don't deal with them in a holistic fashion, the ability to incorporate mathematics into my scientific practice might be worse than had I been trained on these two as being kind of intrinsically related and knowing how to transfer knowledge from one domain to another. So I believe that technical usul and maqasid work the same way. That what I have found in my own experience is that people who took classes in usul and then took a separate class on maqasid, it's very difficult to bring those two worlds together, because this goes back to the human ability to transfer knowledge from one domain to another. Human beings are just not good at it. That's just something which we know from cognitive psychology, that the easier you make it by incorporating dimensions of knowledge together, the more likely it is to be enacted, right, in one's life. So when the maqasid are intertwined within usuli conversations, the mindset and the malaka, the expertise of the mujtahid is being developed in a holistic manner. And so when they think about laws, they're able to think about this simultaneously between the technical aspect and the maqasidi side of it, which is very different than the person who can only do two separate analyses. Okay, let me do my analysis from a technical standpoint. Then I go and use maqasid as a check, and does that work? I find that to be a little bit more rudimentary and less, I think, less nuanced. So I would advocate for teaching them together, but I would also advocate that you need to have the foundational definitions of usul before you can even talk about maqasid. Because if you don't, then my other fear is that the maqasid framework begins to dominate. And so someone begins to take the technical aspects very lightly because their mind is overvaluing kind of these general principles.
There's a follow-up question, actually, so I was wrong about that being the last one. As per usual, I always say it's the last one, there's always a few after. Regarding the maqasid coming after the main sources have been exhausted, the follow-up question is, aren't the maqasid intrinsic in the text? So why would we try to be subjective when the text is bringing objective good, regardless of whether we have understood it or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's clarify a couple of things. So number one is that maqasid as a framework of thinking about law applies just uniformly, I believe. The specific sources of invoking them, like saddu dhariya or istihsan or anything else, right? Those do come, you invoke those typically after you have looked at the Quran and the Sunnah, right, and or ijma and qiyas. But that doesn't mean that you don't think about maslaha and mafsada early on. Now, the question of, are the maqasid intrinsically in the ayat? Of course they are. Of course they are, but that is something which is unknown to the jurists at times. So why is it that two jurists differ on the exact same hadith that's there? And I'm sure you'll talk about this, Abu Dark will talk about it in ikhtilaf, but one hadith is often looked at from multiple angles by jurists in terms of what is the evidence within it. So that is where I'm saying the maqsad is known to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is the maqsad of the ayah known to the jurist? Well, that's where we actually have to begin to have a debate on it. So the Quran is the truth, Islam is the truth. We know that as a fact. Whether our manifestation of it or application of it, that is the field of human endeavor. وَفِي ذَلِكَ فَلْيَتَنَافَسِ الْمُتَنَافِسُونَ, right? That is where that jurists and Muslims compete in trying to be as good as they can and get as close to the hukm of Allah as possible, knowing that we'll always err and make mistakes. So this is why there are some of those qawaid fiqhiyah that says you cannot resort to ijtihad if you have a definitive legal text. When we say definitive, we mean that the meaning of the text is not really open to debate. Everyone agrees on what it means. So when you all agree on the meaning of a verse or a hadith, we don't now go to the field of ijtihad and look at maqasid because there's no debate. We're talking about maqasid and all these secondary considerations when there is a debate over what the text it means itself. So that's one way to always bound this conversation. That, do you know what it means? Does everyone agree on its meaning? Yes. There's no room for maqasid here. Does people differ on the meaning? Yes. Okay, now we can enter the realm of maqasid to see which meaning is more appropriate to achieving the laws that we think Allah is trying to achieve the benefit that we think Allah is trying to put onto humanity.
Okay, inshallah. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and conclude today's session. Barakallahu feek to Dr. Osman Umarji. Thank you everyone else for joining. Inshallah, the next 2 weeks regarding ijtihad and ikhtilaf will actually be by Brother Muhammad Hannini. Then the last session will be Abu Tariq, inshallah, or Brother Iyad. So with that, we'll go ahead and conclude. Barakallahu feekum for everyone for joining us, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khair.